and to be talking about this important history and the many issues that it evokes. Our conversation will last about 30 minutes, give or take, and then we will be happy to open it up to questions from the audience. When you came into the theater, and you can see someone over here, and I believe over here, who have index cards, you may have them. Please write your question on the index card. We'll collect them and pass them forward, and I doubt we'll get to all of them, but we'll try to get to a number of them. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. Dr. Charles Chavis is Assistant Professor for Conflict Resolution and History at George Mason University. Before that, he was the Museum Program Coordinator at the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum, part of Morgan State University. He also received his PhD from Morgan State University, so maybe some of you know him here. There you go. He's a prolific scholar on numerous subjects, including the history of Jim Crow-era lynching in Maryland and the Jewish responses to those lynchings. And he has worked very closely with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, and I know that in his new role at George Mason University, that relationship is going to continue to grow. Rebecca Dupas, next to him, began working with the museum, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, when she was 18 years old, as a high school senior. She was an ambassador as part of our Bringing the Lessons Home program. This is a program that encourages high school students to learn Holocaust history and to have the opportunity to take that history back into their communities, share it with family, friends, colleagues. And she is now a program coordinator at the museum in our community partnerships branch of our youth and community initiatives. Before coming to the museum, she was a high school teacher where she found ways to share this history with her students, and she leads and trains many groups nationally, internationally, about the importance of this history, of Holocaust history today. And she is also a poet. Stephen Fischler, next to me, co-founded Pacific Street Films in 1969, produces and directs documentaries on a variety of diverse topics, including the New York garment industry, martial arts, animal rights, and surveillance. He is one of the producers of From Swastika to Jim Crow. This first premiered as part of PBS's Black History Month in 2001. And at that time, the New York Daily News described it as, quote, an affirmation of the human spirit, of the ability of one human being to touch another, irrespective of race, religion, or politics, end quote. So thank you all for being here tonight. And for Stephen, I wanted to start with you. Can you just talk a little bit about how you learned of this story and just how the project developed?
The project developed at a time when there was a lot of news coverage that was focused on discord between Jews and blacks, and there was a letter to the editor of the New York Times by Professor John Herz, who was one of the professors you saw in the film. And in his letter, he said, people are forgetting there was a time when black institutions lent a helping hand to Jewish refugee scholars like myself. And he mentioned the book by Gabrielle Edgecombe, From Swastika to Jim Crow. And when we read we saw the letter, we said, you know, this was really intriguing. We thought that this might be just like an interesting subject to pursue as a film. And we contacted Gabrielle, we contacted Professor Herz, and we said, you know, we realized it really was a story. And one of the things that we really got excited about, it was one of these almost forgotten histories, that if Gabrielle hadn't written the book and if we hadn't made the film, I'm not quite sure we would know about this interesting phenomena of the refugee scholars at HBCUs.
So newspaper coverage, particularly at the time, was a great reflection of what we knew across the United States about various events. And certainly that was true of the Holocaust. And the museum recently launched a new special exhibition on Americans in the Holocaust. And we hope you will come down and see that. But as part of that effort, we developed a crowdsourcing program, really, that invited people across the country to look for and submit articles from various newspapers, big, small, otherwise, in African-American papers and in Jewish papers in many communities. So Rebecca, can you share a little bit more about that? And then also focus on that maybe from the standpoint as a teacher, both formally then and, of course, with the museum now, about the significance of that sort of a resource to help us learn more.
Sure. So it really is an amazing program or initiative at the museum where communities of people, students, historians, scholars, are adding to the museum archive by going to their local libraries or wherever it is that they can search for old newspapers and looking for evidence of what Americans knew of the Holocaust. So what was the focus, what was making headlines here in the U.S. between 33 and 45. And from that, we get an understanding of the conversation and the sentiment here in the U.S. And we also have a very unique collection of especially what the African-American community was thinking and saying during that time. So as an educator, I had an amazing experience with some of the young people that I work with at the museum in the summer. I had a small group of college-age students who participated in this program. They went to the MLK Library in D.C. and did some research. They were able to discover 21 articles that had not yet been discovered. And as a result, one of my interns, a student at a local university, was able to discover something that the museum actually put into our new exhibit. So for her, that was a very memorable moment, being able to contribute to history in that way.
And how many articles have we found?
Oh, great question. So far we found over 20,000 articles, and they represent all 50 states.
And this is particularly important. We've always known the New York Times covered it. We've always had a perception that people didn't know. But with this many articles in this many communities across the United States, it's helpful to understand that context. Charles, can you talk a little bit more about the same concept, but within the specific research you've done with the African-American newspapers and their coverage and the way in which that relates to the consciousness within the communities about what was happening in Nazi Germany?
Yeah, so, hold on, am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah, so what I've been able to discover is that when Hitler first came to power, the black press was able to make connections between the KKK and Hitler that the white press would not dare make. And what's really interesting about that, and this is actually one of the images from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper here in Baltimore, started back at the turn of the 20th century. And what the Afro was doing was really shedding light onto this historic relationship between blacks and Jews that dates back to arguably the nadir of the race relations in this country, where the NAACP was founded, right, with blacks and Jews coming together around their experiences with terror. Jews experiencing terror from the pogroms in Russia, and African Americans experiencing terror during the height of the lynching crisis at the turn of the century to form, right, the NAACP. And so I think what we see in the Afro's coverage is a unity that is built on that legacy of the black and Jewish relationships that was really, it's oftentimes overlooked, but it was really started, like I said, at the turn of the 20th century. And so that's important to understand when we're seeing the images and what's coming out of the Afro. This is a part of a tradition of the Afro and of the black press. I think that is overlooked. But also, not only did we have images like that, but also Dr. Kelly Miller at Howard University echoed that one viewpoint, the positive unifying viewpoint, where African Americans really value the struggle that Jews went through, and they saw commonalities in those struggles. But he also authored an op-ed discussing the relationship and the importance of the relationship between Jews. But within the black community overall, there was varying viewpoints within the black community, as in most communities. And so on one end, where you had this one pocket of the African Americans that were really connected with the Jewish struggle and saw the unity that could be built, you had other African Americans who expressed their I guess, distrust for, America getting involved in the affairs of Jews overseas, right? And you can imagine, and all this was publicized in the Afro, these opinions, which was really remarkable. So within the black press, they were able to get all. I think you lost me. Yeah, so hopefully that'll answer.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more, Charles, about the perspective of or sort of the atmosphere, I suppose, on HBCU campuses? We certainly heard about some of this in the film, but with some of your research, the atmosphere of some of the Jewish immigrant professors.
So what's really remarkable, like my research focuses on lynching in Maryland, and what I noticed in researching lynching in Maryland, I noticed that no one talked about it. A lot of scholars didn't talk about it, and it's because of Maryland's unique nature, as a border state, right? So is it the South or is it the North, right? And you can definitely see that in the way that scholars have chose to focus on Maryland overall and exclude Maryland when talking about Jim Crow segregation and systemic racism and racial violence. And so what I've noticed also in research focusing on refugee scholars at HBCUs, the majority of the research focuses on HBCUs in the Deep South. And so in conducting my research, it was really hard to be able to find some refugee scholars who came to northern schools such as Morgan State University or Lincoln University, but I was able to discover one professor who came to Morgan in 1949, Dr. Gerd Ehrlich, who and his story is very remarkable. But he came to Morgan during Dr. Jenkins' administration and was hired as a part of a group of elite, I believe an elite group of scholars who came to Morgan at this time, in that Dr. Ruth T. Sheffey was started the same year that Dr. Ehrlich started at Morgan in '49. But his journey began in 1938 in Germany when he was expelled from high school after the Night of Broken Glass. He would eventually lose all of his family to the Holocaust. His mother and his sister died at Auschwitz. And he arrived at Morgan State, like I said, in '49. And we don't know much about his time here at Morgan, but after speaking with Dr. Sheffey, she was supposed to come tonight. Dr. Sheffey, are you here? She wasn't able to make it. But she was supposed to come tonight, but I had a conversation with her. And she remembered quite well Dr. Ehrlich here at Morgan, and she talked about how dedicated he was to the students and how rich a jewel he was to Morgan when he came. Because during that same year, Dr. Jenkins started an inaugural program, an actual foreign language laboratory, and Dr. Ehrlich was actually working in the foreign language laboratory teaching German.
Thank you. So we are within sight of the end of this round, and so I want to encourage you to begin to write your questions if you haven't, and just pass them to the side where they can be collected. Rebecca, this film reflects a time when people totally disconnected come together and found common ground and found, really in many ways, learned from each other. The museum experience, the experience at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is aimed very much at having a similar effect, bringing people together, learning together. And there really is no better example than that, than the Bringing the Lessons Home program, of which you were a graduate. And after that, you went on to Towson University, where you brought the experience with you, clearly. So can you talk a little bit about what you did and just some of well, just tell us what you did.
Sure. So I carried many lessons from the Bringing the Lessons Home program rooted in the Holocaust, and one of which was to have the difficult conversation. It was something that the creator of the organization instilled in us, that instead of running away from tough conversations, we should have them. So when I got to Towson University, I joined the Black Student Union, and we were 1 year looking for something to do for Black History Month. How would we celebrate or commemorate our history? And I suggested that we collaborate with the Jewish student organization on campus, Hillel. And initially, some of the board members rejected the idea, didn't quite understand the idea, which I understood, and we had somewhat of a tug-of-war conversation about why this might be a great idea, and eventually they sided with me. So we created this month-long dialogue between the Black students on campus and the Jewish students on campus. What we did was 4 events over the month, and we started off with a trip to the United States Holocaust Museum, where we talked about the history of the Holocaust, Jewish history. We also visited the Great Blacks in Wax Museum in Baltimore, and we talked about the experience of Black people in America. And at the end of the month, we were invited to Hillel office to have Shabbat dinner. And so it was just like in the movie, when Berinsky had the white and Black people together in that back room. For many of us, it was the first time that we had eaten with the opposite group, but it was certainly the first time that the Black Student Union had Shabbat dinner. And so it was certainly some great conversations. There wasn't necessarily a miracle that happened from that, but it was recognized on campus as the most multicultural student event in the Mid-Atlantic. And it set a precedent at the university for the 2 groups coming together.
So I know that certainly when you think about your experience and we think about the history that was portrayed in the film, there's really no way to compare, your college experience with the climate of the American South in the 30s and 40s. But still, you had some experiences that reflected you were dealing with human beings, you were dealing with emotions, you were dealing with stereotypes and bias, just the same. So can you just talk a little bit about Under the Covers, how you dealt with some of that, and maybe a couple of vignettes?
Sure. So there were multiple student groups on campus, but we weren't necessarily dialoguing with one another. And one of the reasons why I thought to initiate this conversation is because there were some racist, racially charged incidents on campus. I remember a young man standing in the middle of the student union and yelling out the N-word one day. I also remember the university considering turning the Black Student Union office into a closet, and how offended we were because that was our safe space. I remember the young Republican group on campus having an affirmative action bake sale and charging the Blacks less than the whites in order to send some message about how they were treated unfairly because we were at the university, those of us who may have been because of affirmative action. And so there was certainly tension in the air. I had a great college experience, but those incidents matter. And it really did motivate me to do my part, which is something I learned through the Bringing the Lessons Home program, to at least start a conversation, even if it was just for those groups involved.
Thank you. Stephen, this film came out around 2001, I guess, was the premiere. So almost 20 years later, I'm struck by the idea that though we have evolved as a society beyond the climate of what we see in the film, I think we understand ourselves a bit better now than we did. But we also see manifestations of the very same ingredients that were present then, and bias and hatred. And in Charlottesville, it was a particularly brazen combination of many of these different elements. And so 20 years after, almost 20 years after the film was premiered, I just want to let you share a little bit about what you hope people will take from it that perhaps they can apply to the environment today.
Well, first off, I think it speaks to your introduction to your question there, that I think there's, perhaps the film is maybe more relevant now than when it was first released. And in the last couple of years, there's been a great increase of interest in showing the film. And I think clearly that's a manifestation of the current political climate, the overt racism and acts of anti-Semitism. But I think, one of the points that I felt was inspiring about the film, and I hope people see that or share that, is that this was really not a one-way situation. This wasn't just the refugee scholars coming and, educating the students in black colleges. It was also the HBCUs providing an opportunity, a job, a life for these people. So there was a real quid pro quo. And I think that's really, that's the point that we really wanted to make in the film.
Charles, do you want to maybe offer some thoughts about the same thing? Just sort of what do we take away from these kinds of things, from the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Charlottesville, but what people oftentimes forget is before Charlottesville, there was Mother Emanuel. And then after Charlottesville, there was a Tree of Life synagogue. And for me, these recent events point me back to the research that I've conducted and what I've seen, that what we're seeing today is a part of history, American history, that we don't want to talk about. And I think we have to, if we're going to move forward and get towards truth and reconciliation, we have to understand this history before we can get to bringing about truth and reconciliation, and also unifying the black and Jewish family together as it once was before.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I'll give space for that round of applause. It's okay.
So before you answer, let me just say, please answer the same to the same issue. But I also wanted to ask Rebecca to read a poem that she wrote, which was inspired very much by the experiences that she has had through all of this. So,
certainly. Regarding Charlottesville, I love the point that was just made. My greatest confusion was that we, as communities, Jewish and black communities, experienced it separately, though it was a unified attack on both communities. We had white supremacists and neo-Nazis marching. It was a clear offense to me. It was a clear offense to Jews. But as communities, we did not come together and have a single conversation about that. Instead, we were separate, dealing with the same issue. And so I think it is important for us to recognize when those situations present themselves where we should and very well can have a unified front to push back against the hatred that showed itself in Charlottesville. The poem that I wrote is called An Unlikely Voice. I have it here. I wrote it for the 20th anniversary at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to really explain my connection to the museum. So, I am not the likely voice of a Holocaust survivor. And I presume that according to perspective, there are more likely torchbearers in this room. One might assume that a black woman with a history of her own wouldn't relate so heavily to this history, but wrong is wrong. Injustice speaks volumes no matter which side of the belief system or cutter line you are on. I remember how in a crowded curriculum, my senior class covered 12 years of terror in just one day, and I remember being unable to walk away. I was so intrigued by how little my textbook had to say. And then I learned about an opportunity at the museum to get involved. So for 12 years, I've resolved to speak out against the evils of this world, because in speaking for one, I indeed speak for all. Elie Wiesel reminds me to tell the world to remember. And I hear Dr. King's dream. I've learned that the evils of the world never sleeps, that if I don't speak out for others, there will be no one left to speak for me. And I'm reminded that this is my story, that there is no such thing as a likely voice, that I must bear witness, that silence can never be my choice. Thank you.
okay. So I have a few questions here. If you have others, again, pass them to the side. For Charles, can you talk a little bit about the differences between HBCUs in the Northeast versus the South?
Okay, so that's good. So basically, in Morgan State University, I can talk about Morgan because I graduated from Morgan. And so because most people know my background, my master's at Vanderbilt University, undergrad at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So my PhD experience was my first HBCU experience. And so this is when I actually was able to learn so much about the rich history of HBCUs. But what I've noticed being born in North Carolina is that in Baltimore, in Maryland, HBCUs functioned differently, but yet the same. And this is really around the whole idea of what it means about diversity. And so I think, for me, HBCUs in the Mid-Atlantic region are a little bit different because of their viewpoints towards diversity. I think that has a lot to do with the tradition of the Great Migration, for example, where you have African Americans who are coming up to the North with escaping terrorism and things like that to be educated. It's a little bit different from those experiences offer a different educational experience than the South does. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a little bit longer question. So after visiting both the Equal Justice Initiative and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and teaching about the Holocaust, I can't help but see so many parallels between slavery, Jim Crow, and Nazism. Aside from this film and book, are there other resources and exhibits that delve deeper into these similarities? Stephen, perhaps, or?
Well, I'm really not a social scientist to answer that question, but I will kind of maybe answer it in a slightly convoluted way and say that, just give one example of kind of an interesting history. We're pitching a project now called Music in the Mob, and it's about how modern music industry's connections were in some ways created by the organized crime. And the way this project began, I'll get somewhat to the point that you're asking, was we made a film a number of years ago about Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and got to meet some of Morris Levy and some of the people who were the heavy hitters who helped create that, and realized at that time that in the 1950s there were two music streams in this country. There was popular music, which was generally white music, and there was race music, which is marketed to black and Hispanic audiences. And the mobsters couldn't break into the music industry, the Capitol Records, the major labels, which they knew were very profitable. So they hooked up with people like Alan Freed and others who realized that if they played authentic music, black rock and roll, to white audiences, they would really like it. So in some ways, and this is a little interesting history, that the unintended consequences of their wanting to make money was they desegregated the music industry. So, I mean, my point is that we have to look, there's just a lot of strange ways that social change happens. And I just want to throw that one way out, so we need to think more creatively when we look at certain situations. Thank you.
Either of you? No? Okay. So here's a question which I think there's there's something pretty deep in here. So I don't know that we'll be able to go into this all. But it says, do you think that we have come to the reality that races of people are more alike than we are different?
No, I think that we have a long way to go. I think that's the end point. And I think that there are certainly groups of people who are leaning towards that understanding. But I think we have a lot of work. My initial answer is simply no, we have not gotten there.
So this is a question that was directed to Rebecca. It actually says Miss Rebecca, by the way. She doesn't want to be that old, by the way.
I'm fine.
But I would say, Charles, you might have something to say about this as well. If I wanted to start a multicultural group at Morgan State, what advice would you give?
I would start with the board of that organization and make sure that it's reflective of the student body that you would wish. So you certainly represent a single group, however many layers you bring to that, but you're representing a single group. If you want people to be comfortable, they have to be able to see themselves in the organization. And that's something that I've learned working at the Holocaust Museum, obviously as a Black woman, that the way that we get students engaged oftentimes is by reflecting who they are in the staff, at least within my branch. So I think that if you are demonstrating inclusiveness, that people who gravitate towards that and need that will trust you to have the conversations and put on the types of activities that would support their journey here at Morgan State.
Yeah, I would say, just to shout out two people, I would say get with Pace McConkey and Dr. Simone Barrett. And if you are here on campus at Morgan State University with the Robert M. Bell Center, because the work that they've been doing is definitely work that embodies diversity in a way that's really unique to the HBCU experience. And so I think that's really important. Connect, it's about advisors. If you're gonna start a student group, you have to have a good advisor who is dedicated to students, and those two individuals are really dedicated. So I would put you to them. I would give them their emails, but I don't want you to bombard them with emails right now.
Charles, sorry, this is for Dr. Chavis. Where should I go if I'd like to expand my horizon in conflict resolution? It's a great question for him, of course. And I'd like to have more convos, but I have to better, basically I have to better my understanding.
Well, meet me at Mason, because the program, I'm actually just honored to start at Mason with the program for conflict resolution in their school. It's actually the founding school in the nation, the first conflict resolution program. And so that's really important. But my research as a historian focuses on the history of, as I mentioned, racial violence, as well as conflict and contentious political conflict. So my take on conflict resolution is unique in that it focuses on the history, right, understanding the history. And in order to understanding the history, we'll be able to have better solutions for future and current problems. And so the literature is vast, but if you want to really pinpoint literature, I would focus on one of the founders of peace studies, and that is no one other than himself, but Dr. Martin Luther King. The entire discipline of conflict resolution and peace studies is all rooted in the work of Dr. King. And so begin there, but as a historian, I would tell those interested to focus not only on the theory, right, but also the practice as well, and really dissecting the narratives of individuals such as Dr. King, Rabbi Heschel, and really dissecting the decisions that they had to make, right, when they chose peace and nonviolence in the midst of racial terror, right.
And I would just add to reflect something Rebecca said about the idea of a shared experience. Exercise that opportunity to share experiences together with groups, and that will certainly be a huge part of any conversation that relates to conflict resolution. Stephen, perhaps this can be for you. How did the rise of the Black Power movement affect the careers of the Jewish scholars at HBCUs? Did they come to a close?
Well, I think it was a difficult time for them. I don't think it came to a close. And I think that in spite of the kind of, sort of vociferous, expressions of the manifestations of Black Power, African Americans should teach their own history. But I think in spite of that, that these professors were able to weather that, and I think that they continued to be accepted and admired on the campuses they taught at. Berinsky, I mean, that section follows the Berinsky section in the film. They built him a house on campus, and he lived on the campus of Tougaloo. I mean, Tougaloo became his life. And I think this is also reflective of some of the scholars that they often didn't want to talk about their lives in Germany that they had left, and focused all their energies on their situations here. And in fact, Berinsky is buried on the campus of Tougaloo, and it's a pretty moving place to go. I visited his grave several years ago.
Another question for Stephen. By the time you learned about this history, many professors had already passed away. What do you think they would have told you about their time at HBCUs?
Well, we did get a few of them, so hopefully we reflected their stories in a way that they would be simpatico with. I mean, we did know Professor Herz, the Rasmussens, Professor Manasseh. So I think we did our due diligence. I mean, we researched more than the 5 that we really focus on in the film, but the decision we had to make is which of the scholars do we have the most information about, both conceptually, historically, and also the visual material to support those stories. And so that's how we made the decisions of the ones that we included. We did research a few more, but these were the 5 who seemed to be the clearest stories that came across.
Is there a part 2?
There may be a part 2. We're working on making a dramatic film inspired by some of the stories in the film.
We'll all be invited to the premiere, by the way. To all of you, can you talk about how Black and Jewish, or just students of communities of difference, come together again, find common ground, shared goals?
We have to do more events like this, right? I think this, for me, is really inspiring. And for me, as a historian, like I said, looking at what I know about the Black and Jewish relationship historically and how Blacks and Jews came together throughout the history of this nation, moments like this are very inspiring. Yesterday, we were in Philadelphia at the United States American Jewish History Museum, where we had a group of predominantly Jewish individuals there and African Americans as well. But to have it on a HBCU campus is very powerful, and I think this is where it begins. It can begin again. Yeah.
Rebecca?
I automatically think about the Bringing the Lessons Home program, and I certainly don't want to do an infomercial, but it is my honest opinion that programs like Bringing the Lessons Home are models for how it is that you get students, many of which may not have heard of this history, certainly are not Jewish, to come together and have conversations with other students from all walks of life. And it wasn't necessarily a pitch to learn history. It was an opportunity given to youth in the DC area to play a role at an institution, to come in, we're gonna trust you to lead tours at this institution. And while you're doing that, we're also going to promote civic engagement and talk about democracy and promote ideals of tolerance based on the history that's at the core of the museum. So I think that it's really just about opportunity. And so stepping away from Bringing the Lessons Home, invite people to have conversations, whether it's in the back room of your classroom, at a university, or even in your homes. I think that we have to set the example, pretty much.
Stephen, you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I would just say that at least, you know, my work and my idea is just to try and explore our shared history, not look just at contemporary events, but kind of look back as well, and maybe that will provide a context for people coming together today and in the future.
So the last question is one I'm going to ask Charles, and that is, I know of at least one person here who was actually in the film. And there may be other people who are associated with your work, who you've met, and I just want to give you a chance to say a word about them.
Yes, so Senator Mitchell, it was in the film. There's a scene that where police brutality was discussed, ironically discussed, and there's a scene where there's a picture from the Baltimore Afro-American where Senator Mitchell was beaten, and he's here, but Dr. Ruth Sheffield did not, was not able to make it, but she also sends her regards. And so just knowing that these people are still around and the things that they went through is really significant. And I think that the young people who are here really need to understand the value in having these pioneers who are with us. And so when I look at the image of Senator Mitchell, I think about Freddie Gray and the ways in which police brutality continues to be a problem in the Black community. But it's something that is not new, right? It's a part of this legacy that we have to root out and really deal with.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for the conversation. For the record, Professor Gerd Ehrlich, Congressman Perrin J. Mitchell at Morgan State University. For the record. Thank you. So I want to thank, just in closing, I want to thank the producers of From Swastika to Jim Crow for bringing this history to light. Thank you, Stephen. I want to thank Morgan State University for hosting us here today, our partners, the Baltimore Jewish Council, the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and the Associated. With the opening of our Americans in the Holocaust exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in D.C., it's a great time for you to come down and to learn more about this subject. If you can't come down, come to our website where there's a lot of information about this. And also on March 12th, we are going to be hosting a program called Nazi Ideology in the Jim Crow South. It will be the second in a series entitled Hate and Its Impact. And the program will look at how Nazi Germany was influenced, by the legal and social structure of discrimination in the American South. And if you can't get to that program in person, which maybe some of you cannot, please watch online. It will be streamed, ushmm.org/watch. Thank you very much for coming, and good evening.